So Joe and I are going to do a little switching and swapping during the presentation. It's going to be in 5 parts. We're going to start off with discussing what makes a great waterfront in the abstract. Among all the waterfronts, there's been a lot of development of waterfronts around the world. And it's getting to the point where there are a set of rules, so to speak, about what making a great waterfront. So we'll share that with you. We'll deal with a lot of waterfront precedents, other waterfronts, and show how they would relate to this site. We'll then talk about objectives and influences, many of which came from the discussion that we had last time. And then we'll go into a set of strategies that would make a master plan, and then we'll summarize it. So I'll take you first through the making of a great waterfront place. So it's a great waterfront is a place which has a mix of uses. It should be a place to work, live, and play. It should not be an isolated, independent, single use. It should build on its context. All the really great waterfronts in the world have usually had some kind of context to them, and building on that context is important, and so we should do that here. Great waterfronts incorporate public destinations of some sort. Some of them are small, some of them are large. They build on the existing assets and the history of the place. They reinforce the relationship with water. They optimize public access, one of the things you've asked for. They have a memorable public realm. Public realm being the place where people, these might be streets, parks, beaches, wharfs, but places that are publicly accessible. And they have buildings which frame and animate the public space. Not only buildings, but uses as well, that frame that space, animate it, and make it a fantastic place to be. Most have a visible sense of identity, which may include landmarks of one sort or another. And finally, a great waterfront is a place which is embraced by the community. So Joe will now take you through a set of waterfront precedents.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be here and talk about wonderful waterfronts across the world and here in Ontario at the mouth of the Credit River. I'm going to take you through a couple of sections. The reason we look at, by precedents, what we mean is, well, what have other people done in other places that we might be able to draw upon? So it's not by putting forward these examples, we're saying it should be exactly like this or it should be exactly like that. We're simply trying to draw lessons from what other people have done in similar contexts or where there are lessons to be learned. So that's the kind of point of this exercise. And what we've done to help you understand the way we've explored it is when we are given a new site to look at, and a site with a certain kind of scale to it, we sometimes put into it at the same scale of drawing precedents from other places in the world or other places in the city or other places in the neighborhood to give us a sense of its scale, its character, its potential, and its possibilities. So I'm going to walk you through a bunch of these. So this first one is not to suggest that we think terminal warehouse should come down before credit. That's not why it's up here. It's up here for a couple of other reasons that we think is relevant. One of them is, many of you may remember that the waterfront in Toronto was once a fairly quiet and non-public place, and mostly marine-related and industrial. It wasn't a very major public place. It's we're not quite on the way to a great public place, but it's moving along in that direction. And this building, the terminal warehouse building, had a long marine history. This was effectively a major storage warehouse for marine activities in Toronto's waterfront. And it was an early and central part of the transformation of Toronto's waterfront into becoming a much more public space with a broad range of uses there. Of course, that's downtown Toronto. very different kind of place, different kind of scale. But the transformative power of taking an industrial marine location and turning it back into a community place with a diversity of uses and kind of reforming its economics, if you will. There's lots of examples of that, certainly around the world and certainly locally. The other thing that's interesting about this, on the plan that you see there, you're seeing the scale of that shed that I'm sure everybody is familiar with, and you see the lower image of that shed. That's a big shed. And you can see how long, and many of you, we're guessing, are familiar with terminal warehouse. You know how big that building is. So look on the plan, the length of terminal warehouse compared to the length of that shed. That's a long shed. And of course, terminal warehouse is much bigger and taller. It's also interesting to see they're almost the same width, just again as a sense of scale. It's kind of a block width. So the site's kind of in a north-south direction, kind of 2 blocks wide, if you take that measure up. And in this transformation that we're talking about while not abandoning the marine uses that gave it its life, bringing other life to it, the development of the pedestrian realm in particular becomes a really key ingredient to the success. So what was once an industrial area here at terminal warehouse where ships loaded and unloaded, and there wasn't much public activity. In fact, it was like with the shed now restricted. The place has been transformed. There are trees, there are public spaces, there are different gathering places. People work there, they play there, there are cultural things. There's all kinds of ways to bring life to the waterfront. So that's one we started with. Another one we're looking at, and again, I want to emphasize, we're not suggesting this is what should happen, but again, to see what lessons we could draw, is take recent development pattern on the waterfront here in Port Credit. So the townhouses that are a little to our east, the mid-rise 6-story buildings and other things that are a little to our east, you're going to be familiar, I think, with the 2 photographs of similar places. And you can see in that plan, just to the east of the CLC site, is one of those U-shaped 6-story terrace buildings coming down to the water that I think you're all familiar with. So what we did is, what if we took that footprint and kept marching it along? You can see there, and that's simply a matter of trying to help you with scale. We can have 2 or 3 of them. We're not suggesting we would make identical buildings. We're just saying that's giving you a sense of the scale of that site. And if you look at those townhouses, you see townhouse lots are typically much smaller than traditional house lots that we're familiar with. You can see the sort of width of those townhouse roads and those blocks and the kind of texture and fabric. So this is mostly about texture, fabric, and scale as a kind of lesson. But there's a couple of other things here as well that occur to us, and one is about character. What kind of place we want to create here to complement and contrast places that are already here, and the issue of affordability. And this theme's going to come up in a couple of things. And this issue of scale we want to talk about tonight. What is the appropriate scale for rejuvenation of these lands? So we've heard people talk about low-rise and 3-story scale, for example, in the past. And the local area plan speaks to that, and also mid-rise form. One of the things that comes along with low scale, townhouse scale, for example, is the townhouse form as a potential. The townhouse form is highly residential. It's our impression that that we wouldn't want to be making this a kind of townhouse development in what we traditionally understand as townhouse development, in the sense that that feels like you're entering somebody's neighborhood. Now, we're always going to be entering somebody's neighborhood down here, whether they're working or living, but the more privatized that neighborhood feels, the less public it is. And we feel that this destination wants to balance these uses and wants to be welcoming and welcome people from across Mississauga, across Peel region, across Southern Ontario, candidly, but at the same time be an extension of the community. So what's the way to find that right balance? That's something we've been struggling with. And so one of the things about built form and character and use, it comes along the identity and character of the neighborhood, and also its affordability. If we have very modestly scaled, very little development, it's going to have to be extremely expensive to support the rejuvenation of the site. So that's this issue of accessibility from an affordability perspective also comes into that. This is a place that I've visited and I'm familiar with, and some of you may or may not be. It's a hardware site in San Francisco on the south part of downtown near the baseball stadium, actually. Big piece of land comes in, again, industrial, marine past, being transformed. There's actually an expressway here where they've put some parks under expressways like we're starting to think about, all of that kind of thing. A couple of things to note again. Interesting how the scale of this fits so interestingly well into the scale of this site. Again, it's that 2-block wide kind of texture that we're seeing with different precedents, that you're going to see more of that. So that's one thing. If you look at this image, which is an aerial view, the photograph, of course, and whenever you're seeing an aerial view, everything looks more massive, and you're seeing the bulk of it. But we wanted you to understand and illustrate what they've done here. You're seeing the water in the foreground in a water's edge walkway, and you're seeing a 4-story scale to that water's edge walkway that terraces back. So that additional scale to this particular development is not right on the water's edge, but terraced back away. The other thing that is not evident in this photograph, but I can attest to, is the range of uses that are in this new community. It's right on the edge of downtown. There is a lot of residential use, but there's a lot of other kinds of use in here too. Work uses, institutional uses, new kinds of park spaces. So it's taking an old industrial place and turning it into an extension of the downtown San Francisco neighborhood with its own unique identity. And it has a different scale and texture than other places we're looking at, but here you get that sense of a kind of a 4-story scale, and along the water's edge here, you can see that expressway in the distance that's been ingeniously developed underneath, as I said, and a variety of relationships to the water's edge. So we thought that was an interesting one. And the Europeans, of course, are doing lots of interesting things. Many of you might be familiar with Amsterdam and the East Harbor lands in Amsterdam, which were extensive. And extensive industrial piers, not unlike what we have here. All of them almost now redeveloped over probably a decade or more. And projects of a variety of scales. We're going to show you 2 of them. This is one of the first ones. And East Harbor District 1. And what you're seeing on the bottom photograph is an aerial view where you see a kind of an unusual looking building with that kind of strange shape, looks like a giant ship or something sitting in the neighborhood, and that low-rise 3 stories character beyond it. What's interesting here is you're seeing the texture of what they did there when applied to this site is 3 blocks wide. So it's a smaller scale, smaller fabric, a different kind of texture to it in terms of the fabric and the kind of scale of local streets and passageways. You're also seeing east-west connections and diagonal connections that show porosity of movement in both directions, the importance of movement at the ground plane in both directions. So it's not a place where you got to go for a long walk around things all the time, but you've got shortcuts and that kind of character to it. One of the things about this first phase of development in the harbor lands, because of this scale, this project became highly subsidized by government. So again, it became somewhat expensive, both in terms of building and affordability, and also in my experience of visiting it. And partly it's not the same location as this, it's a little more isolated, and so it feels like you're going into somebody's neighborhood and you're kind of at the dead end of something, and so the continuity is not quite the same there. But its scale reference is something that, and its patterns are something that we think there might be some lessons in that. In further developments, this is Eastern Harbor District 3, so 2 districts later, what you're seeing is an uptick in scale because they've figured out how to afford to do all of this. They've had to bring some additional density, but there's still an interest in diversity of form. Lots of different variety, not one kind of building. In this case, in this district, what you're seeing, you don't see the water on either edge, but I can assure you there is water on either edge. They've organized the major public space in the middle rather than on the water's edge, which we found was unusual. We tried it out here. We're not sure that's the right way to do this. We think the primary public spaces want to be along the water's edge probably, and you'll see how that will unfold here. But also what they're doing here is they're introducing iconic buildings. You see that big circular building, that drum building at the end, which is a mixed-use building, primarily residential. It sort of becomes this iconic landmark. So the notion of landmarks at the water's edge, especially at the end of the pier, whether that's a desirable thing here or not remains a big question to us. But again, we just wanted to explore that possibility in this precedent. I had the joy of actually being able to live in Copenhagen last summer for 2 weeks. My wife and I rented an apartment, and we lived in this neighborhood. And we just had heard about this place. It's an established canal neighborhood in just off the main river in Copenhagen, for those of you who have been there. So again, lots of water activity, a tradition of that, a tradition of some old buildings, but lots of new intensification of newer projects, but at a reasonable scale. You can see the upper photograph of this kind of 4 to 6 story building with the kind of residential addresses. So they have enough water frontage there that they have a whole variety of water's edge experiences. And you can see the variety of transportation in the lower photograph, all kind of sharing informally these roadways. So the roadways are built of a very high quality of material. They're very durable. It's not like they're ripping up asphalt potholes every couple of weeks. It's very durable, long-term materials. Cars come here and understand that pedestrians and bicyclists are in the neighborhood and that they need to kind of behave, that everybody shares these zones. It's not in a thoroughfare. When you're coming here, everybody's going slow. And so that's part of the experience of this place and its character. And this is kind of a pedestrian level scale view of this. Of course, this is a canal community. I appreciate it's not exactly the same, but some of these qualities are desirable. This kind of casual informality of it, the easy relationship with the water, the right relationship of scale that gives containment and interest to the public realm, the ability for boats and marine activity to give different kinds of life to the neighborhood. It was a lovely place to live for a couple of weeks. I could have imagined spending more time there, and I'm imagining I will. Malmö, Sweden, some of you might have heard about. There's a couple of things about this. A brand new community on the west coast of Sweden, and in fact within eyeshot of Copenhagen. I never knew this, but when you go to Copenhagen to the beach, across the way you can see Malmö. And what you can see in Malmö is this tall iconic tower in the right-hand corner. So most of the development, there's a few things about Malmö. One is it's on the water's edge. It's pedestrian vehicles are basically not very visible. So there's not a lot of emphasis on vehicular movements. A lot of the parking is concealed, and there's good transit connections, though it's a little isolated as a community. And there's a heavy emphasis on pedestrian movements rather than vehicular movements. So the cars are in there again. You can see a kind of, I would call it an informal urban plan. Some would call it chaotic on purpose, but it's meant to be sort of almost medieval and sort of idiosyncratic in its organization to provide that kind of diversity of experience as you wander through it. It has a significant sustainability agenda. So energy savings, being very careful about water and resources, being very thoughtful about durable materials. So that theme is again going to emerge in other projects of really putting a sustainability theme to the development is also important. And the issue of microclimate when you're on the water's edge. A lot of thought here was given to winds off the ocean, it's the Baltic Sea, and how to deal with all of those issues. And of course, a site like this, we have to be thoughtful about that kind of thing, especially given the importance of year-round use. One of you might be aware that with Terminal Warehouse, that first precedent, one of its challenges has been its retail life. It's gone through lots of cycles because in the winter it's hard to make that place work. Now that all kinds of people are moving down to the waterfront and living there, now it's suddenly working. And what's happening is that, just as an aside, I just heard this last week, the operators of Terminal Warehouse have recently decided to transform its retail idea from a tourist notion to a neighborhood retail perspective. And again, I'm not suggesting that's the same thing here, but now it's going to make sense as a facility in the middle of this neighborhood, and its retail functions will be in fact stronger moving forward. Granville Island in Vancouver, there are a number of lessons to be learned here. I'm guessing lots of you might know about it that have visited. There's a lot of wonderful things about it. First and foremost, perhaps, is its kind of marine quality. The marine life that was traditionally there didn't go away, just other life came, and it all kind of works together. It's reusing old buildings in very creative ways, bringing lots of new buildings in, bringing a diversity of life to the place. And also in terms of the design of the public realm and the walkways, for those of you who've been there, again, this kind of easy informality between vehicles, pedestrians, bikes. People generally are slowing down when they're here. It's a destination. Now, the other thing about Granville Island, it's isolated in itself within Vancouver. It is a major tourist destination. You'll remember some people talked about Navy Pier last time, and other places like Granville Island. And one of the things we struggled with in listening to that commentary and other ideas is this the place that wants to be a major tourist destination in that sense, Navy Pier, Granville Island? Or is it an extension of the existing community with with regional interest. In other words, it's not only about local neighbors. This is, because it's the mouth of the credit, it's a very important place in the sort of geography of this region, of course. It's not just anywhere, it's not just any neighborhood. But the impact of bringing a native pier or Granville Island here would be quite significant on a community of the scale of Port Credit. The kind of traffic impacts and population impacts, when it becomes much more of a tourist destination, and not where tourism is only a modest, or it's an aspect of a larger mixed-use picture. And it's the latter that we're thinking is more appropriate, rather than a kind of native pier. This is, the big idea. That's a high-risk venture, and it has built form option implications to it. And I think this is the only one or two more. The Olympic Village in Vancouver, of course, the success of the Vancouver Winter Olympics. A lot of people heard about this, the controversy about delivering it, its affordability, and those kinds of things. There are a number of interesting lessons, though, in a very positive way about the Olympic Village. Many may know that Vancouver's recently been the place of towers and podiums. That's the lesson of, or that's the sort of form of Vancouver. They consciously went here and said, we don't want to try something else. We want to try a scale that makes more traditional streetscapes and a different kind of neighborhood. And it's not about towers. So that was a conscious effort. The holistic approach to planning, the emphasis on great public spaces, great streets, great parks, the water's edge, lots of investment in a great place. So it's a neighborhood in and of itself, but it's also part of a regional movement system and regional contact through the water's edge. Again, interestingly, it's a significant sustainability objective, especially on the energy side. The objective of net zero, hugely ambitious. And so as a result, partly, a very expensive place to buy a unit, as people heard, and affordability and accessibility and diversity of lifestyle here, perhaps a question. But nevertheless, many interesting things about that place. So again, those precedents are simply to help us understand what scale of property are we dealing with, what range of potential might it have, what character do we want to it, what lessons might we draw from other places we've looked at. And not to say that this is an exhaustive examination. Some of you might have other suggestions about places we've not looked that you think we ought to, that are particularly relevant to Port Credit and this place, and we're interested in hearing from you about that. I'm going to sort of now go through the third part of our presentation called Planning Objectives, and this is based on partly what we heard from you last time, partly what we've understood from the local area plan, and partly it's our own team's collective effort in looking at these sites and bringing forward objectives. So we're going to start with broad objectives and then sort of focus down. This aerial view, I think, is quite important in terms of the significance of this site to the transformation of Port Credit's waterfront. So this first objective, contribute to a great Port Credit waterfront. There's a great beginning here already. First of all, geographically and naturally, it's the mouth of the Credit River coming into Lake Ontario. So that makes it a special place right off the bat. Historically, a community was developed here. And at some point in its history, a pier and wharf extension was made here. And so it's at a key position. We've got development to the east. We've got a park to the west at the mouth of the river. We've got a municipal marina there at the moment and a restaurant. All of you are aware of that. We've got Lakeshore just to the north. So this large marina site is kind of a linchpin in the middle of all this. Its redevelopment will be transformative in terms of public access and the kind of character of the community in this particular part. So the way in which this site gets developed has to really understand all those parts that exist and how to really help bring them together and bring out the potential of this site over time. And the most important thing is the connections back to the existing community, of course. That it's got to grow from and relate to and complement the place that's already here. And that place is both historic and contemporary. It continues to transform like all great communities do. They don't stay still. They build on their past, but they rejuvenate and they bring new life to them. And so that I think is a really key element of great community development, is how you respect the old and bring in new and continue to bring new life to places. So that's certainly an important objective of this exercise. As we've described through those other precedents, a place like this is a destination. It's a special place, and it requires a lot of attention to detail. So the quality of the public realm, those places, is incredibly important. As we intensify and we have more people sharing these public spaces, They have to be durable, they have to be beautiful, they have to be functional, they have to be safe, they have to bring joy to us. What else to come down to the waterfront? And, it's Sunday afternoon and all of those kinds of things. And that diversity of experience is also key. Another important part of it, we think, is diversity of life. That if it's only residential, that's not going to be a great diverse community because it's just going to be too much of one thing. But we believe that residential ought to be a part of it. And that's what, as I just mentioned in the Toronto waterfront experience, it's what helps establish a neighborhood and make it an extension of the existing community and not just a tourist destination. And it helps, make the place go. It ought to continue to be a place to work, and we ought to be looking for opportunities to bring other kinds of work here. What might those be? And of course, play means lots of things. Sometimes it's just having a coffee. Sometimes it might be a child playing in a water sprinkler. So it might be throwing a frisbee. It might be going for a walk. Who knows? It might even be going swimming, or sailing, or kayaking, or all of those things. And of course, this place already has a history, as Roger mentioned, and we heard loud and clear. And of course, the lessons of other waterfronts is you don't get rid of the marine activity and that presence. You keep it and build on it. So how do we do that? But keeping the port credit is critical. And the design quality of the buildings complements the design importance of the public realm. There needs to be a lot of attention paid to the way in which buildings define and give life to public space on a lot of levels. We also, through some analysis, want to be very cognizant of influences on the development, and that one of our objectives is that the master plan will take, will make reasonable judgments around these influences. So there's a couple of things from this diagram that I guess we want to emphasize. State Bank, Elizabeth Lane are all streets to the north, north-south streets that are very important in terms of connecting to the community. We need visual corridors down those streets. We need places for people to be able to walk down, to drive down, to bike down. So those places of connection, of visual connection, of physical connection become very important influences on the pattern of development within the CLC site. That's number one here. East-west, of course, is also important. We understand transit's coming, so we have to anticipate and be ready for that. And the quality and character of Port Street, we want to talk about a little more in that regard. We've got a waterfront trail to the east. We've got some connections to the west. This site's in the middle. We have to find ways of connecting through. And that's both pedestrians and bikes, and they don't always belong in the same place. So we have to figure those both out. We've got a scale of buildings on the north edge of Port Street that are our neighbors, and we need to understand what that scale of buildings means to the scale of buildings on our site and the character of the place. The hotel we're in here, a 14-story structure. The building to the east, the port's at 6 to 7. There's an application, as many of you will know, active for the no-fill site, and then there's mid-rise development further to the east, as you can see there. And there are particular moments with the stars that become important places of arrival. When you come to the bottom of Elizabeth, where the water's not very far from you, you're kind of arriving at the water's edge. What should that place be like? We want to show you more about that. The pier itself, we've defined a park edge and a water edge, and that's suggesting our definition of local places within the site. So Plouse Park is a terrific place. At the moment, it's got a kind of chain link fence on its east boundary and a kind of no access zone for many people. But that could be a great address. That's a great park address. The other side, the water edge, is equally interesting and wonderful. So these are different conditions, though, and they require different responses. So those are those external design influences. From an internal design influence perspective, there's a couple of key things, and to remind you of some of what you heard last time. The original shoreline that you can see drawn there, the distinction between the original shoreline and the land north of the shore versus the landfill south is quite significant from a development perspective. So north of the shoreline in the original, the natural stuff that's there, you can actually dig down, and we can put some structured parking in and deal with various parking concerns that will be inevitable to a redevelopment scheme. But once you get into the landfill, it's just all stuff that's thrown in there that we've built on top of. So it's much more expensive, much more difficult, much more challenging to dig deep there. So we're not going to probably dig deep there as a result. And so that influences how things happen as well, and we have to be cognizant of that. There is a level change at Port Street. And many of you are aware of that. That grade change is actually something significant, something you have to account for in terms of making a great Port Street and how this development would front that street. Along the wharf wall, that east side of the shed building, are tiebacks. That dock wall is based on, so it's holding all that water back. So it's doing that by having all these tiebacks every 3 or 4 meters going all the way along, holding up that wall. Those tiebacks go right into the shed. And so they have an influence on development. And another point that James was making is that we have to make sure that structure remains intact for a very long period of time, and it's got some age to it. So that's another influence in terms of the existing site. And of course, all the boats and mooring places, the marine activity itself is a pretty significant influence. So these are all some of the things that have got us thinking about how to put a strategy together. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Roger to talk over master plan strategies that we've developed so far.
Thank you, Jess. So we called this the anatomy of the master plan, and you'll recall from James' comments that this plan that we're doing is not the final product. It's not a plan or design for a set of final buildings. It's a set of principles or strategies which will define how that next stage will work. And as Joe said, they come from what you told us, they come from local area planning directions you've already set, and they come from our own understanding of the opportunities and constraints of the site. And we've put together a kind of a vision statement. We'd be interested to hear your comment about this. We think this place should be a place to live, work, and play, direct access to water, with a strong waterfront character integrated into the Port community. And to realize this vision, we use a set of master plan strategies, which I'll go through. So the first strategy is to bring access to the water. And the main means of doing that is the waterfront trail. So the trail today wraps around on the east side and, comes in from the east side and kind of wraps around the municipal marina and House Park on the west side. And it's diverted along Port Street. So the first thing we need to do is surround the site with the waterfront trail. So it comes right around the site, and the entire waterfront now becomes a public place. Fences are down. It's no longer a private area. The marina may stay, but and so there may be private uses of it, but in the fundamental waterfront is public. And we should try and bring out the potential of the character of the various parts of this. And we see that there are kind of 3 major parts of the waterfront, of the waterfront trail, and we've called them the North Promenade, the Wharf Side, and the South Promontory. And you can see where they are on that diagram. So the North Promenade at present is a natural shoreline, and we, to create the waterfront trail through it, we would see some built embankment to it. So it would change its character and become what we call a North Promenade, tree-lined streets, tree-lined major pathway. This diagram is of the work we are currently doing in Toronto's waterfront. And we see something similar to that on that North Promenade. On the wharf side, we have this existing situation with the long shed along one side of it. Some of that shed, as you'll see, we think should be kept. At present, there's a 15 meter dimension between the existing shed and the water. It's a very generous dimension. And we could see some part of it supporting having a built form and use, which really supports a public use of this place. The South Promontory is a great spot at the end of this pier overlooking the water. This is a shot taken from a distance of that zone. And we could see the waterfront trail coming by at the south end with a park on one side of it. A small park continuing the glass park tradition. The second strategy has to do with street connections, and in many ways the street is the thing that defines the community. It's the public thoroughfare, the public place. And Elizabeth Street comes straight down to the edge of what would be the north promontory. Helene Street comes down to the water, and Stave Bank doesn't, but it could, as it curls around and faces the waterfront. So the existing streets, as you know, Stave Bank, Elizabeth, and Helene, stop at Port Street, and we propose that they would continue through. The third strategy has to do with views to the water, and is very much related to the idea of street price coming through. So for each of these three places, we must be careful to make sure that we maintain the view through to the waterfront. And here's a kind of diagram of it looking the other way. Fourth, we should have some places for parks and plazas, larger areas of the public realm, and we think they should be associated with the waterfront trail. And we see three of them. So the first one is what we call Marine Plaza. This is the end of Elizabeth Street. It's right at the point where currently the boats are taken in and out and the fueling occurs. So it's at a very crucial kind of place, and this is a place where we would want to have a larger open space. And we see it as a very mixed kind of space, something like happens on Granville Island, where trucks and boats can come in when the boats are being dropped into the water or taken out, and at other times they leave. And it's the sort of place that when there's a festival over here, it might be one of the local festivals. And then Helene Point is what we call Helene Point, at the end of Helene, that's at the breakwater, at the foot of the breakwater. There's an interesting piece of land there that has all kinds of potential, and maybe it's a place where we could come down to the water. The Promontory Park at the end would be a wonderful place for sitting and watching the lake. So what we do, strategy 5 has to do with the marine and marine uses. So this is an overview of the marina and the shed. So what would we retain? What makes up a marina? Well, first and foremost, it's the boat berths. Secondly, we'd have to make place for launching and fuel facilities. Thirdly, you'd have to bring boat trailer access into a spot where you can do that launching. You need a building to support the marina. And then in terms of marina uses or marina operations, or marine operations, should I say, that you have on the site, some space can be allocated for that. All of these animate the site and create a real asset. There has, however, a kind of a change to that marina use that needs to be accommodated. Presently, the whole place is private and it's fenced. And so the security of the boats is achieved by a fence around the perimeter. Once the waterfront edge becomes a public place, we need to figure out a way in which we can still have security for the boats. And this is a simple diagram where those circles show the point at at which when you move from private to public on the gangways. So you'd have on one side, you'd have a public wharf, and then you'd have a set of gangways which would be restricted to the users of the boats, the owners of the boats. I mentioned this marine plaza idea, and this is where the loading or floating occurs. And it's also a kind of a crossroads of the waterfront trail. So we need to figure out some way in which you can still operate boats going in and out and have a waterfront trail which is safe and secure. And we looked at Granville Island and many other precedents in Europe and other places in which these kind of shared zones occur. And then finally on this strategy, there are other public recreational uses that might relate to the water that we should think about. The sixth strategy has to do with Port Street. Tremendous potential. At present you stand there and it's rather a lonely place. It's not a very attractive place. Very much like Toronto's waterfront main street has been for so long. But it has phenomenal potential. Here is the existing situation at the east end of it. And with the introduction of the transit, why can't we, with bringing in additional people, this is a shot in Portland, Oregon, which we look to as a kind of precedent for that. And then other streets or other ways of getting in. And we need to establish a well-connected street and pedestrian network here. So that's our seventh strategy. And this one could have some variation to it. There's several ways of providing access. You could come down Stade Bank and loop around, which on the top left. You could also connect Stade Bank and Elizabeth. Or you could connect Stade Bank and Elizabeth and come down a central street. Or you could primarily use Stade Bank and an extension of Stade Bank. So there are a number of, there may be other ways in which the sort of street network would work. But we see a terrific opportunity here because it's not a thoroughfare, it's not a through route, it's a place that maybe the pedestrian could be king. There is this expression called voornerfs, which come from Holland, and it's the idea is that you can have, if cars slow down, you can have cars and pedestrians using the same place, the same public realm. This particular illustration is a new voornerf. It's called New Road, and it's a regeneration of that road in Brighton. And the changeover to a kind of pedestrian and car place transformed the economics of this particular street. European towns are full of places like this. This is one in Barcelona where I was recently. You can see the cars and the people mingling. And we've got something like this in Toronto, in the distillery district. Here's a special event occurring in the street. That's the other thing about these kinds of streets, is that you can transform them very easily into festivals. Now, our eighth strategy has to do with the character of the public realm. And we see a variety of characters, and we build on each. There's an expression in architectural and planning circles called genius loci, the genius of the place, the special character of a place, and reinforcing that character. And the distinctive characters we're showing here is Port Street, Marine Plaza, Green Point, North Promenade, the Wharf Side, streets in the middle, the park edge, the promontory park. And I'll go through each of those and give a kind of flavor of what we might do to enhance the character of those places. This is a more formal diagram of the same thing. So Port Street, place for retail, transit, activity. Middle Street's pedestrian priority. The park edge, the interface with the park becomes prominent, important. Promontory Park with views and relaxation and public art. On the other side, the Marine Plaza is a kind of a town square animated by marine uses. Helene Point at that end, the North Promenade, and the wharfside. And we've got a kind of notional set of cross-sections here that try to express the sort of character that these places might have. And this cross-section, and it's not particularly exactly to scale, it's an idea of scale differences. With the Waterside Hotel at 14 stories, no floors at 10, and new development which would frame that street and give it spatial containment, as this one does. The Marine Plaza, which is an extension, as you see on the top right, there's an extension of Elizabeth Street, and that's a kind of working village square, which brings what I've shown, is a kind of a section right across the site, from the river on the left to the wharfside on the right. And the Waterside Hotel shown beyond, and the potential of using mid-rise forms on the site. Sometimes it goes down, and in other places it goes up. Somewhat above it, but of course never in a full high-rise form. And putting that on a plan, the frontages of the buildings are what, and the uses at the ground level of the buildings is what makes the place, what makes that piece of public realm, gives it its character. And so we could see along Port Street, there's on the extreme left, next to the hotel, a higher form that could form the gateway to Port Street on that side. Sort of modestly higher little pieces to the regular mid-rise form as a paired elements as a gateway to the site and into the public square. The parkside frontage, the wharfside frontage, and the park frontage down at the base, at the end of the pier. So that's a sort of a description of the kind of strategies that we're promoting, that we're finding we have comfort with. So, and I'll just go over them quickly. So there's the waterfront trail, there's the street connections, there's the views to the water, there's the parks and plazas, there's marine and marine uses, there's Port Street, there's streets and blocks pattern, there's the public realm character, and then the little form gives it that character. And this is what we use to bring about this vision.